God and science, two words which many people today think cannot go together. Alternatively, many others have simply not thought about it, accepting the consensus view that science has made faith in God much more difficult. Even amongst Christians, there might be the feeling that considering this complex subject simply isn't worth the effort. For many Christians, their faith does not rest on the operation of the created world, what the theologians call the general revelation of God, but rather they have rightfully built their faith on God's word to them through Scripture. So as we begin our three-part lecture series, it is tempting to ask the question, why bother? So given that we cannot directly observe God, we must exercise faith in his existence. Now traditionally, Christian faith is built on four logical pillars, which I shall now examine. The first pillar is our own personal testimony and experience of God. Unfortunately, many Christians today believe that this pillar is the most important. However, I would suggest that the opposite is true. Yes, it is great when we can see how God has worked in our lives, but we must remember that our perception of God is often deeply affected by our own circumstances and mental states. There are times in most Christian lives when God feels conspicuously absent. At those times, we need the other pillars which help maintain our faith. These pillars are God's special revelation, the Word of God, especially as seen through Jesus Christ, God's people, the Church, and God's general revelation, the glory of God's creation and its inner workings. The special revelation is by far the most important pillar that sustains our faith. Through God's word to us, we learn truths about God and about ourselves. We also learn that God's world is a messed up place, which God is redeeming through his gospel and the church. The second pillar is the church. As we meet with other Christians, we encourage each other to continue to work out our salvation as God's power works within us. We also learn through other Christians how God is working through their lives and through his church. The third pillar is God's creation. As the Bible clearly states, God's glory and power is seen through his creation. There are times when many Christians can feel overwhelmed by all the evil in the world. Yet it is at those times that creation can remind us of our timeless God's immense power. An entity that is able to create as many stars as there are grains of sand on the seashore is surely also powerful enough to bring us safely home into his kingdom. Yet sadly, new atheism has not only had a profound effect on keeping people from turning to God, but it has also, for many Christians, removed this pillar of their faith. Although all Christians believe that it is God who made the world, many of them have been made to feel that our modern scientific understanding of the universe really does not support the concept of a creator God. Therefore, many Christians are now missing this supporting pillar of their faith. It is the purpose of my 3 talks to help restore this third pillar for you. I hope that by the end of these talks, you will agree that rather than science weakening the idea that God's glory is seen in the way he has made the world, it has in fact strengthened this pillar. Our modern scientific understanding of the cosmos is even more consistent with an infinitely powerful, timeless creator than the more ancient scientific models which were believed before the Enlightenment. I shall go through the outline of the 3 talks so we can see what is coming up. In my first talk, I shall look at the atheist nature of reality. A fancy philosophical word we can use for this is the word ontology, which literally means the nature of being. We shall look at an atheist ontology in relation to how it affects the interpretation of the modern scientific data, especially in relation to what is known as the God of the gaps. We shall then compare the atheist's ontology with the Christian ontology and demonstrate how scientific knowledge cannot squeeze God out of his creation because he has never been a scientific explanation for the creation in the first place. Finally, we shall look at the 5 axiomatic principles that underpin the scientific method. we shall see that the final axiom, or more precisely principle, means that the methodology of science involves a process of what is called hierarchical reductionism. In the second talk, we shall let our new hierarchical reductionism guide us down a scientific path from biology, where we shall look at the theory of evolution. We shall also look at some cell biology, and in particular the immune system. And finally, we will look at the nanotechnology of molecular robotics inside living cells. From this molecular technology, we will move through biochemistry into physics, where we shall look at the grand unified field theory, the fine-tuning of the universe, and we shall also discover that because the laws of the universe are conserved, they are also time symmetrical. In fact, there is only one law that displays time asymmetry, and it is this law which sets the arrow of time. It is called the second law of thermodynamics. By the end of this second talk, I think most people were feeling buoyed up in their faith as they went to lunch together. Then in the final talk, I will spoil it for everyone as we consider a rather sophisticated atheist counter-argument plus a rather circular argument which has both an atheist and Christian version. This bit of our journey will be the most demanding, so make sure you have an extra coffee, or preferably Red Bull, so you are nice and wide awake and ready to concentrate. After that tough stuff, we will then jump into some natural theology, exploring the truth of Romans 1:20 as seen through the lens of the modern scientific understanding of the natural world. So let us begin by joining a couple at the breakfast table discussing the existence of God. The conversation you're about to hear happens all the time in the Western world. Our friend David is an atheist who is using all the classical arguments that are commonly used by atheists today to argue that a belief in God is now superfluous. In contrast, his friend Jane is a Christian who struggles to defend her faith, at least when it comes to trying to justify her belief that God really did make the world.
You know, Jane, I don't believe in God.
Why not?
Well, science has disproved God.
How do you mean?
In the past, people had to believe in God to explain how things came about. Now, with all scientific discoveries of the last few centuries, we can explain all things by natural processes, independent of divine intervention.
But what about living things, David? Surely you can't explain how they originated?
Of course I can. While living things might have the appearance of design, they are actually products of billions of years of evolution.
I find that hard to believe.
Now who's the non-believer, Jane? Look, while it's impossible for animals to suddenly appear from massive chemicals, it is possible to imagine how they slowly evolved from simple reproducing organisms. As an organism reproduces, slight variations can arise, which alter it slightly. Those variations which are superior at surviving will be selected in preference to the others. Over a long period of time, this process is repeated again and again and again, so that all these variations add together to produce a new organism that's more complex. We look at this complexity and think there must be a God who made it. Yet, we are simply being confused by the total effect of millions of minor improvements which individually can arise by chance and which are non-randomly selected for survival.
But what about your simple reproducing organisms, David? Where do they come from?
I must admit, that's a difficult problem. However, there are several brilliant theories involving natural chemical reactions that could have been used to form the first reproducing molecules. Once you had these things, natural selection would ensure that they were further adapted into single-celled organisms that we see today.
But exactly how? How can you get from simple molecules to simple cells? which possess a whole host of machinery designed for reproduction and cellular function.
Look, while I cannot explain exactly how DNA and the machinery needed to read it came about from simple, non-producing systems, can't you see there's a problem with believing in God? Ancient civilizations believed in God simply because they couldn't explain how anything happened naturally. Today, we have been able to explain so much of the complexity we observe by appealing to natural processes. Of course, there are still gaps in our knowledge, but can't you see, Jane, that the reasons for your belief are becoming less and less? Take the eye, for example. A few hundred years ago, people argued that its design conclusively demonstrated that there had to be a creator. Yet now, scientists can give a very convincing hypothesis of how something like an eye can evolve from creatures which possess nothing that allows them to see. So it's only a matter of time before we discover how reproducing creatures came about from the basic chemical compounds. At that point, what island will your God stand on?
Well, I don't believe you, David. There has to be a flaw in your argument somewhere. I think evolution must be wrong. John lent me a book recently which said that the evidence for Darwinian theory is very dodgy.
Oh, Jane. You say that because you have no idea about science. Face it, Jane, God died with the birth of Darwin.
Perhaps some of you have been in a conversation similar to this one. The person you were speaking to was very much like David and felt that atheism was justified because science had pretty much disproved God. If we were to represent God and atheism in a tug of war, as I have done in this slide, it would seem that atheism and science together have just about dragged God across the line where he loses. However, a large component of David's argument was not based on scientific data, but on a philosophical argument known as the God of the gaps. The best way to understand the force of the argument is to represent it diagrammatically, as I have done in the current slide. On the screen, you will see I have represented all that can be known about the universe as a light yellow circle. In AD 1000, we only understood a tiny bit of what could be known, and so there was plenty of room to explain the things we didn't understand by appealing to a supernatural creator. With time, our understanding of the universe has increased as shown. Perhaps this is the state in 2019. Today, many people feel that there is only a little bit of the universe left to understand. I personally think there is probably a lot more, but unfortunately people tend to be arrogant and think they know a lot more than they really do. With time, however, it is believed that even this little gap will disappear, and then we will no longer need God to explain how things came to be. Those who hold to God of the gaps atheism think it is a thoroughly modern belief, proved by modern science. Yet many atheists have not properly thought through how science actually works. My aim is to briefly show how science works, and how, with just one extra assumption, it will always lead to God of the gaps atheism, even if we only understand as much as the people who lived before the time of Jesus. There are two main parts to science: observation and theory. These two parts support each other, with observation leading to theory, which in turn guides future observations or experiments. These future experiments then modify our theory, and so result in new experiments being devised to test the modified theory. This positive feedback loop is why the practice of science over time has been so successful at helping us make sense of our universe. However, it is important to realise that all theory comes from the human mind, and thus all experiments, no matter how elegant or complicated, must be comprehended by the bodily senses, usually the sense of sight, and sometimes, if you're a chemist, the sense of hearing or smell. Hearing if you create hydrogen in a test tube and then make it pop with a match, and smell if you accidentally make hydrogen sulfide. While it is possible to propose something that cannot be observed by human senses, the validation or invalidation of all scientific theories requires experimental data obtained through one of our 5 senses. Until an idea can be tested by experimental data, it remains in the realm of philosophy, not science. This loss of distinction between testable and non-testable hypotheses has led modern physics down a rather strange path, as we shall see in the final lecture. So the scientifically observable universe equals what can be observed directly with our 5 senses, or indirectly using devices which convert physical data into something which our 5 senses can detect. Now, the God of the gaps argument makes a very big assumption by supposing that reality consists only of the scientifically observable universe. In contrast, the Bible tells us that the universe was made by God, for it says in Genesis 1:1, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Now, just as an engineer who makes an aeroplane is not actually part of the aeroplane, so God, who makes the universe, is not part of the universe. I have represented the biblical viewpoint diagrammatically as a rectangular surface. The rectangle represents what is real. God is real, and so he is in the rectangle. Some things that would not be in the rectangle would include logical contradictions, square circles, collisions at a distance, or mythological entities, unicorns, etc. Sorry to the young people who like unicorns. God creates the heavens and the earth. The biblical concept of heaven is more than just the stars in the sky. It also represents a spiritual kingdom where beings such as angels and demons exist. This is represented by the blue circle. In the yellow circle we have the universe which we observe. Our God-given natural senses means that in practice we can only ever know everything about the yellow circle. We may infer from the yellow circle that there must be more to reality than it alone, but we can never prove or disprove the case using scientific inquiry. This also means that the God of the gaps argument has always been possible, regardless of how much of the yellow circle we know. Because God does not interact with our universe in a way that is directly observable by our bodily senses, it has always appeared highly automated. So atheists all through the ages can claim that the automation observed in nature justifies their conclusion that there is no God. In fact, we can know for sure that atheism was a viable belief system before Christ because the Bible itself criticizes such a belief. For we read in Psalm chapter 14 verse 1 that only a fool says in his heart there is no God, a verse written over 1,000 years before Christ. So let us return to David and Jane, who are 2 people now living in 300 BC. And this is just after the time of Aristotle. Again, Jane and David are at a breakfast table, but alas, they can no longer enjoy Kellogg's cornflakes. While the breakfast cereal and science have changed, David's atheism is still very much the same.
You know, Jane, I don't believe in God.
Why not?
Well, why propose something that's clearly not observable?
But David, how do you explain where everything came from?
While we may not understand completely how things work, it is clear that they do work without any direct intervention from a heavenly being.
But what about living things? How do you explain them?
They come from mummies and daddies. You know the facts of life, don't you, Jane?
Of course I do, David. What I meant is, where did living things come from in the first place?
I must admit that's a difficult problem. But can't you see that if people are made by natural processes, then it's only a matter of time before we discover how those natural processes operated to produce the first living things. Anyway, why are you so convinced that life is so special? We now know that all things on earth, whether living or non-living, are composed of the 4 basic elements: earth, wind, fire and water. And that the secret of life lies in how these elements are arranged. The fact that a piece of meat, when left to stand for several days, produces maggots demonstrates that the elements in dead things often spontaneously rearrange themselves to produce simple living things.
But exactly how, David? How do you get from the 4 simple elements to living things that can reproduce themselves?
Look, Jane, of course, I cannot fully explain how the reordering of the elements takes place. But can't you see the problem with Jewish belief? Ancient civilizations believed in a God simply because they couldn't explain how anything happened naturally. Today we find that many things which appear complex, like life itself, are really a lot simpler than we first imagined. And so we have been able to explain most things by appealing to natural processes. Take farming, for example. Before we learned how to plant and grow crops, people appealed to the miraculous appearance of plants to demonstrate that there must be a creator who cared for them and fed them. Yet now, farmers can explain how plants grow up in certain places because seeds are first planted in the ground. While there are still gaps in our knowledge, it's only a matter of time before we discover how all living creatures came about from the 4 elements. At that point, what island will your God stand on?
Well, I don't believe you. There has to be a flaw in your argument somewhere. I think the whole theory behind farming must be wrong. John lent me a scroll recently which said that the evidence for farming theory is very dodgy.
Oh, Jane, you only say that because you have no idea about science. Face it, Jane, God died with the birth of Plato and Aristotle.
Let's return to our diagrams of reality. Interestingly, in 300 BC, the ancient Greek model of reality was also an atheist one. Similar to the theist model, we begin with a rectangular surface, which delineates what is real. However, in an atheist worldview, God is not located inside a real category, but rather is listed alongside with unicorns in the unreal category of myths and legends. The universe, of course, resides within reality, and in ancient Greek atheism was considered infinite, had no beginning. Therefore, the requirement to propose a creator was superfluous. Interestingly, the Greek model under Plato did have another category located inside reality, and this was the notion of Platonic ideals. Platonic ideals were really a recognition of the apparent independent existence of logic and mathematics, which appeared to transcend human existence, which of course was located inside the material universe. Now, modern cosmological data has forced a modification in the ancient Greek model for atheism, in that the Big Bang theory has eliminated the option that the universe is eternal. The finite age of the universe, which is believed to be around 13.8 billion years old, means that atheists now require an explanation for how the universe came into being in the first place. In particular, 2 findings of modern science which are unknown by the ancient Greek atheists were the values of the cosmological constants, which cannot vary very much or else life cannot exist. This is called cosmological fine-tuning, and the complicated nanotechnology that exists within all cells and which is the basis of all living things. It is now time to look a bit more deeply at the philosophical assumptions that underpinned the modern scientific method. During the first lecture, as an exercise, I got those who are listening to the lecture to discuss these 3 different philosophical questions. First, can you prove your own existence? Can you prove the person next to you exists? Can you prove that your external reality is real? I then got people to discuss these 3 different questions for a few minutes. and then we got feedback on what people thought could and could not be proven. Most people felt that number 1 was definitely provable. Many people felt number 2 wasn't provable, and more people felt number 3 was provable. Now, as always with philosophy, one can debate it either way, but I believe that number 1 definitely is provable, while I think number 2 and 3 are not provable. And I'm going to explain why. Number 2 is fairly easy to show that it's not provable, because you could be a brain in a bottle. The idea that other people are real is an assumption, a sensible one, but still an assumption. You're assuming that your senses are giving you real information about your world around you. But as in the movie The Matrix, Keanu Reeves finds himself in the unusual situation where he is just a body inside a big tub, and all the reality which he thinks is real is actually an artificial reality that is being fed to his brain. What about the third option? Well, some would argue that if you exist, there must be a reality that also exists to support your existence. This is true, but what about if you're the only thing that exists? That's very narcissistic, I know, but let's say that you are the only entity that exists, and when you cease to exist, all reality ceases. In this case, you could argue there is no external reality because you are the reality. Of course, this is a silly argument, but it does bring us to our first axiomatic principle or presupposition of modern science, and that is the coexistence axiom. There is a cosmos that is independent of ourselves and about which our senses give reliable information. In other words, we are not a brain in a bottle, and we also assume that when we die, reality doesn't cease to exist. We come into reality, we're born into reality, and we die from reality, but the reality continues on with or without us. So hopefully I've convinced you now that it is not possible to prove your world is externally real or that other people exist. But why do we argue that we can prove our own existence? In other words, why is the famous Cartesian statement, "I think, therefore I am," true? Why is it true without relying on any presuppositions or assumptions? The reason it is true is as follows. We start with our reality rectangle, which in this case we have labelled existence. The first definition is existence. We define existence as anything which is, and which therefore can be defined. The second definition is thought, which for our purposes is any mental activity, including the act of defining. So it follows that thought must be a subset of existence, since it can be defined. We just did it above. Now, when we make or think the above statement, then it follows that we do exist because we have shown that thought resides in the category of existence, and so we who think must also reside there. Now, this is a beautiful example of what is called set theory. You will notice I've not had to resort to any assuming this or assuming that. I've simply started with logical definitions, the definition of existence and the definition of thought. And then I've concluded that because thought must be inside existence, and it is me who is thinking, then therefore I must also exist. Now consider the following statement. The first definition is existence. We define existence as anything which is, and which therefore can be defined. The second definition is thought, which for our purposes is any mental activity, including the act of defining. So it follows that thought must not be a subset of existence, since it can be defined. We just did it above. Now, when we make or think the above statement, then it follows that we do not exist, because we have shown that thought resides in the category of existence, and so we who think must also not reside there. The only change I've made to the above paragraph is to insert the word not in red 3 times. In doing so, I've created a statement which is completely inconsistent with itself. For I define existence as anything that is and which can be defined. I define thought as any mental activity, including the act of defining. But now I say, despite the fact that thought has just been defined, and I have defined existence as anything that can be defined, that thought is not a subset of existence. This is a simple contradiction of the definitions I have just created. Thus, the statement is logically incoherent. We often see these types of logical contradictions also used in humorous exchanges, like the one on the screen. Prosecution. Did you see the accident? Witness. Yes. Prosecution. What happened? Witness. The cars collided head-on. Prosecution. And how far apart were they when they collided? This, of course, makes us laugh because, by definition, if two cars have collided, then the distance apart must be zero, since this is the definition of a collision. You cannot have a collision and also have the cars apart when they collide. Again, it is a simple contradiction in terms. We can now state the next axiom of science, which I shall call the coherency axiom. It can be argued that this axiom is more fundamental than the coexistence axiom because the laws of logic are at a more fundamental level than external existence. We saw this in being able to prove, without resorting to presuppositions, that we exist, even though this is the only thing we could prove. The coherency axiom goes as follows. Any system of thought which links together more than one definition must do so in a way that ensures that none of the preceding definitions are contradicted by the linking process. The third axiom now follows directly from the second and is critical to science. It is simply the idea that experimental theories must be judged on how well they model and predict the external reality which we assume to exist independently of ourselves. The corresponding axiom can be stated as follows. For a theory to be considered valid, it must be correspondent with observed reality. It must describe and predict the observed data. The main building blocks of science are actually the first axiom and the third. Remember our theory and observation diagram? Theories are generated by the mind, but in order to judge a good theory, it first has to be coherent. In other words, a theory which has logical contradictions will not get off the ground. Once it is coherent, the theory is then tested against experimental data. If it explains the observed data, then it becomes a valid explanation for the observed data. If not, the theory may have to be modified or even dropped. We now come to the fourth axiom. The laws of the universe are conserved through space-time. Probably one of the most beautiful and modern examples of this axiom was the finding that the speed of light was constant, independent of the inertial reference frame. In other words, a person who is travelling towards a light beam at half the speed of light must find that its propagation speed is exactly the same as someone who measures the speed of the light beam while moving away from it at half the speed of light. The mathematics that makes this statement true leads to the blending of 3D dimensional space with time, resulting in a 4-dimensional space-time continuum. At a more practical level, the fourth axiom also means that experiments must be repeatable independent of time or location. If a scientist performs an experiment in one laboratory and another scientist performs the exact same experiment somewhere else, then the fourth axiom demands that the results from both experiments should be identical. If the data is not reproducible, the fourth axiom prevents us from arguing that the laws of the universe have changed. Rather, we conclude that there must be something different in the way the two scientists have conducted their experiments, and it is this difference, which is perhaps unknown, that is leading to the different results. The fourth axiom also means that science cannot fully deal with experiments or observations which are truly non-repeatable. This is important because the origin of life on Earth is a non-repeatable event. Therefore, while it is possible to come up with many creative theories and ideas about how life first came into being, none of these ideas is ever fully testable in the same way as theories which deal with the present operation of the universe. Just as the origin of life is a non-repeatable event, so are all other miraculous events. For example, science cannot arbitrate on whether Jesus fed 5,000 people in the desert or raised someone from the dead, because these events are not within the normal operations of the cosmos, just as the origin of life itself is not within the normal operation of the cosmos. Atheists reject miracles on the basis that they are violating the laws of nature, because the laws of nature they have perceived are based on experimental data that is constantly repeatable through all space-time. As we shall see in the final lecture, the trick that scientists employ to explain the non-repeatable event of life itself is to use the concept of mathematical probabilities to propose special events which would normally be viewed as impossible in the day-to-day operations of the universe. At this point, both the atheist and theist argument for the miracle of life, or the miracles of Jesus respectively, are not so different. The atheist justifies his or her belief on the view that given enough time, even the most unlikeliest thing can happen, while the Christian justifies their belief on the idea that the creator of the cosmos is able to modify its normal automatic mode of operation to fulfill his special purposes. It is this normal automatic mode of operation that we use to develop our laws of the universe. Before I introduce the next axiom of science, let's have a conversation with a guy called Faustus, who always had a soft spot for demons. What causes friction? Faustus. Little demons. They just stand in front of things and push to stop them moving. I can't see any demons even on the roughest table. Faustus. They are too small, also transparent. But there is more friction on rough surfaces. Aha, more demons! Because there are more places for them to hide on rough surfaces. Oil helps. Oil drowns demons. If you polish the table, there is less friction and the ball rolls further. You're wiping the demons off. There are fewer to push. A heavier ball experiences more friction. More demons push it and it crushes their bones more. If I put a rough brick on the table, I can push against friction with more and more force, up to a limit, and the block stays still, with friction just balancing my push. Of course, the demons push just hard enough to stop you moving the brick, but there is a limit to their strength, beyond which they collapse. But when I push hard enough and get the brick moving, there is friction that drags the brick as it moves along. Yes, once they have collapsed, the demons are crushed by the brick. It is the cracking of their bones that opposes the sliding. Faustus is pretty certain about his demon hypothesis, and in many ways it meets the first and third axioms in that it is a coherent and correspondent theory in relation to the properties of friction. It is of course easy to design an experiment to disprove his demon hypothesis, oil the table and then sandpaper it. However, even if this hypothesis could fully predict every conceivable experiment one could conduct in relation to friction, there is still a problem with this hypothesis in that one is introducing a much more complicated entity, a demon, to explain a much simpler and fundamental entity, friction. We can tell that Faustus's demon hypothesis is in trouble in its final statement, which simply creates a circular argument. Remember Faustus's final statement? Yes, once they have collapsed, the demons are crushed by the brick. It is their cracking bones that oppose the sliding. Yet why do the cracking of the demon's bones oppose the sliding? In other words, it is not the demon that is now causing friction, but their cracking bones, which gets us no further forward than our original question of why objects, when rubbed together against each other, experience a force that opposes their motion. It was the Christian monk, William of Ockham, who first understood this problem. He solved it by introducing a famous principle which is now known as Occam's razor. In this slide, I have reproduced both the Latin and English translation for his famous razor statement. In English it reads, "Plurality is not to be posited without necessity." Put simply, I don't introduce more complexity into experimental data than I am trying to understand. Putting it into our own axiomatic framework, if a theory is both correspondent and coherent with a certain number of laws and entities, then the introduction of any new laws or entities, which do not increase the correspondence of the theory to the reality being described, is invalid and must be avoided. It is this principle which stops science using unhelpful circular arguments, like Faustus's demon hypothesis. It also means that the scientific method is reductionistic, or more precisely, it displays what Richard Dawkins has called hierarchical reductionism. It is reductionistic because scientific explanations take complex data sets and reduce their complexity through various hierarchies of explanation with underlying scientific hypotheses. For example, if one is studying the many possible values of acceleration, force and mass, all three entities can be related into a single formula: force equals mass times acceleration. It is this simplification of the experimental data by developing an underlying principle that explains the data that makes the scientific method so powerful as a tool to help us make sense of our reality. However, while the 5 guiding principles of science make the scientific method one of the most powerful intellectual tools we possess, it does not mean that science can answer all questions. The desire by some to make the scientific method the arbitrator of all truth is a distorted form of science known as scientism. New atheism, unfortunately, has embraced scientism, and in doing so they have inadvertently given Occam's razor a bad name. When I gave this lecture at Platt, in the discussion that followed, someone challenged me on my support of the reductionism that is commonly used in science. Many people today are critical of science because they see the problems of applying hierarchical reductionism to answer all questions about our reality. Yet the solution is not to remove hierarchical reductionism from the toolbox of science. This methodology has been shown repeatedly to help us develop scientific theory. No, the right response is not to use hierarchical reductionism where it is not warranted. Using a simple DIY example, a hammer is great for hammering in nails, but very bad if you're trying to build a computer. A hammer is not suitable for every DIY job, just as hierarchical reductionism is not suitable for every question we might want to pose about the reality in which we find ourselves. It is hierarchical reductionism that determines which statements are scientific. Let me show you now what I mean. Let's consider the following statements. Which ones are scientific? Why did John kiss Kate? Because John loves Kate. My son is guilty of stealing because I saw him do it with my own eyes. The reason why we convicted John Smith of the murder of his wife was because DNA evidence suggested that the chances of him not being the murderer were 1 in 50 million. Our modern understanding of living things and cosmic fine-tuning suggests that they were both created by an entity which possesses immense power and an intelligence that is not observable. So I then got the group that were watching this lecture to tell me which of these statements were scientific. In general, the group were able to eliminate statements 1 and 2, and saying they weren't scientific. However, many people thought statement 3 was scientific, and some people felt statement 4 was also scientific. However, I would argue that none of the statements are scientific. The first statement is not scientific. While it is an answer to the question of why John kissed Kate, the answer is not a scientific one because love is a far more complex entity than a kiss. While science may be able to suggest certain biological processes that occur in the body when someone is in love, love is a construct which exists purely within the reality of human consciousness and relationships. Therefore, it cannot really be understood by studying the more fundamental physical processes that occur within the human brain. This is especially true when it comes to ethics. We cannot learn moral statements from the cosmos because the theoretical framework that gives birth to a physical human does not possess in it entities like love and hate. The second statement is also a valid answer to a valid question. Like a scientific statement, it is also based on evidence obtained from one of our 5 senses. Yet it is not a scientific statement because it has not reduced the complexity of experimental data to more fundamental principles. The third statement sounds more scientific, and it is certainly using the methodology of science to answer an important question in relation to whether someone is guilty of murder. Yet the statement itself is not a scientific one because, like the second statement, it is not attempting to develop fundamental principles to understand a complex data set. This is an important distinction. It is possible to use the methodology of science as the basis of concluding something which is not a scientific explanation, but which is still a useful truth for humanity. In this instance, scientific data is being used to protect society from a murderer. The last statement is very similar to statement 3, in that it is using the methodology of science to conclude something which, if true, is critical to the knowledge of humanity. The last statement concludes that our scientific understanding of the universe suggests that it was made by something which possesses immense power and intelligence. Note this statement, like the others, is not using God as a scientific explanation of how things work or came into being. It is simply stating that reality itself displays the hallmarks of design, which is normally the product of thinking beings. Atheists also commonly make an equivalent statement, which is that modern science demonstrates that the universe possesses no properties that are consistent with its origin emanating from a being that possesses a mind. I believe this counter-statement is one of the biggest deceptions that many modern people have swallowed in relation to linking science to atheism. In Lecture 2, I will attempt to demonstrate why this is the case. So let's now look at two classic scientific statements. Both of these are scientific because they are explaining how a component of our reality works. The first statement explains how DNA is used as an information template to produce specific amino acid sequences which constitute cellular proteins. The second statement links the three electrical properties of voltage, current, and resistance into a single mathematical relationship, thus reducing the millions of possible combinations of these three electrical properties down to a single fundamental principle. This is reductionism in all its proper glory. However, the hierarchical reductionism of the scientific method means that the methodology of science itself has areas where it is a valid tool for human understanding, coloured green, and areas where applying the methodology is not valid, coloured red. Now, the boundaries between where science can answer a question and where it can't are not sharp, and this is why in the current slide I've represented the green boundary as blurring into red. Starting where the scientific method is completely valid, we can powerfully use the 5 axiomatic principles of science to generate theories from our mind and then obtain data from biology, chemistry, and physics to test whether these theories are correspondent with the data obtained. This is classical scientific methodology. The application of Occam's razor aids the development of powerful unified theories to explain the operation of the universe. It is these fundamental scientific explanations that have been one of the most successful human activities since the Enlightenment. However, once we get to the level of the human mind, the applicability of the classic scientific method quickly becomes invalid. We see this problem when we consider possible explanations for personal consciousness. For example, let's for a moment propose a rather simple theory that the successful identification of your grandmother depends on the firing of a single neuron somewhere deep within your brain. This is known as the grandmother neuron theory. Obviously, this theory is way too simplistic, but it will do to demonstrate the problem. So the theory goes that when you see your grandmother, a neural network of synapses fire which allows you to identify that the signal coming from your retina is consistent with the pattern of a human person. Another set fires which tells you this person is female. Another set fires which tells you this person is old, and so on. Finally, all these neuronal patterns converge on a single neuron which only fires when you see your grandmother, and it is this neuron's firing that gives you the magical moment of recognition. Yet there's a problem. For one can ask, why does that firing of that neuron result in my conscious identity in relation to my own ego's interaction with my grandmother? Now, some might be tempted to say that perhaps the problem is simply arisen because the theory is way too simplistic. However, it does not matter how complicated we make the theory. It is obvious that at whatever level of synapse firing, one can always ask the question of why that pattern leads to your personhood and not mine. It is fascinating that Dawkins, in his polemic The God Delusion, comments that we are very lucky to be alive because our genetic code represents only a small subset of possible genomes which are created at fertilization and that turn out to be functional in terms of supporting a living human being. Yet this begs the question, why does my particular genetic code lead to me as a person and not you who is watching this presentation? In other words, why do I not look out of your eyes with your genetic code rather than my eyes with mine? Or why do I happen to exist now in the 21st century and not 5,000 years ago alongside other hominids with different functional genetic codes that existed in that period of history? Think about this one seriously for a moment and it will start to mess with your mind. There is simply no scientific explanation for what makes you and alive at this present time. Someone at this point might object. Surely I am me because I am the sum of my life's memories and experiences starting from birth to the present day. Yet this explanation doesn't work. For sure, you have had all these unique experiences just as I have had my unique experiences. Yet this does not change the fact that you are you and I am me, and there appears to be no way it could have been the other way around, even though from a biological perspective our lives are interchangeable. Despite an identical neurological mechanism, your phenomenological consciousness has always been completely separate and non-overlapping from mine, and if I die tonight, while my reality will cease, yours will continue as long as you continue to live. Furthermore, assuming a completely atheist framework, once I die, my consciousness will truly cease to exist and will never be repeated. So how did I, as a conscious being, ever happen to exist in the first place? These unanswerable questions are what philosophers refer to as the infinite regress. An infinite regress is where the answer to a question results in another question and so on ad infinitum. Once inside an infinite regress, one quickly gets to the point of mystery, where a certain question exists that can neither be answered scientifically, philosophically, or mathematically. I believe that questions which are unanswerable clearly set the boundary for the scientific method, and given that these questions are particularly present at the level of human consciousness, it is sensible to place an explanatory boundary on science at the level of the human mind. Of course, I'm not suggesting that all aspects of the human mind are off limits to scientific inquiry. Many scientists are neurobiologists, and likewise the field of psychology is extremely important in helping support those who suffer mental health problems. However, while psychology and neurobiology might help explain certain biological and environmental causes to problems like depression, anxiety, or even psychopathy, none of these disciplines can answer the mystery of why a seemingly random selection of 100 billion neurons leads to your phenomenological presence and not mine. Thus, if we accept that the beginning of the explanatory boundary for the scientific method is at the level of the human mind, then it quickly becomes obvious that concepts which exist above this explanatory level must be forever outside the scope of scientific explanation. While it might be true that when a person experiences the emotion of love or anger, certain measurable biological changes occur, which can be measured and documented by biological science itself cannot arbitrate on the nature of love itself. This is especially so when it comes to ethical questions which govern human behaviour. Most accept that love is morally superior to hate, but this conclusion is ethical, not scientific. If the boundaries of science start at the level of human consciousness, then how much more so is God outside of the explanatory scope of science? This is why in my diagram, everything that is at a higher level of abstraction than the human mind is labelled red, with psychology and sociology occupying areas where parts are applicable to science and where parts are not. The final components of this diagram are philosophy and mathematics. I have purposely placed both these entities at the fundamental level of reality, the same level as physics, but not within my truncated triangle. The reason I have done this is because the truncated triangle represents all things that are present within the material universe. Mathematics and philosophy are not physical entities, and yet strangely, as we have seen in this lecture, they operate at the most fundamental level of reality to power the methodology of science itself. Therefore, it is not valid to ask whether mathematics and philosophy are outside scientific inquiry, just as it is also not valid to equate them to other objects that are the subject of scientific study. They simply do not fit in either a red or a green category, and this is why they are outside of my truncated triangle. We have already introduced the concept of scientism. Most new atheists strongly practice scientism, in that it is their belief that science can answer all questions. Put simply, their reality triangle is coloured all green. Science to them is the ultimate arbitrator of all truth. Under this scheme, God is simply a false invention of the human mind, since they believe that science can and will answer every question that can be asked about the nature of our reality. Yet despite this incredible leap of faith, where science is assumed to have no explanatory boundaries, many modern atheists like to claim that they are the only ones who do not exercise belief. I hope that this lecture has demonstrated to all of you that this is simply a lie. No one is in the privileged position of being able to make conclusions about reality in which they find themselves without exercising faith. While atheism and theism are opposite answers to the question, is the universe a product of an outside creator? Both atheism and theism are equally based on faith. So in summary, I have attempted in this lecture to examine some of the underlying philosophy that underpins the modern scientific method. I have shown that atheism operates on the assumption that if God exists, he would be found by scientific inquiry. Modern science is founded on 5 axioms, the last of which makes its scope of operation bounded to hierarchy or reductionism. The argument that with increasing scientific knowledge, the need for God as an explanation for the universe will become less, the God of the gaps, is false. The God of the gaps argument is based on atheist philosophical assumptions and not on the level of scientific knowledge. The God of the gaps argument could have been just as validly used at the time of Aristotle, demonstrating that modern scientific knowledge does not entail greater support of atheism. So where does that leave us in relation to our God and science tug of war? Well, hopefully this lecture has put the rope back into a more neutral position for you. In the next lecture, I will demonstrate how modern science has in no way helped the case for atheism.